The wind howled through the barren landscape, carrying with it the scent of rain and despair. He stood there, alone, on the edge of what once was his world. The farmhouse he had built with his own hands lay in ruins, its charred beams jutting out like the skeleton of a forgotten dream. The fields, once lush and golden under the summer sun, were now a wasteland of ash and mud. Everything was gone: his family, his livelihood, his hope. All that remained was the quiet rhythm of the rain beginning to fall and the steady presence of his horse, standing silently by his side. This was no ordinary horse. It wasn't the fastest or the most beautiful creature on the land, but there was a bond between the two that transcended words. They had been through everything together: storms that tore apart the skies, winters so cold it felt like the earth itself had turned to ice, and days when hunger gnawed at their bellies like an unrelenting beast. The horse, with its dark eyes full of something that almost seemed like understanding, had always been there. But tonight, even that quiet comfort felt like a whisper against the roar of his despair. The man's hands trembled as he clutched the tattered reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had lost so much it felt like his soul had been hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but the weight of the emptiness. The memories haunted him: the laughter of his children as they played in the fields, the warmth of his wife's hand in his, the dreams they had shared under the stars. All of it was gone now, taken in a single, merciless sweep by the cruelty of fate. He didn't know where to go or what to do. All he knew was that standing still felt like surrender, and he couldn't bear the thought of sinking any deeper into the abyss. As the rain began to fall harder, the horse shifted beside him, its ears twitching as if it had caught a sound that he couldn't hear. He glanced at the animal, its coat slick with rain, and for a moment, he thought he saw something in its eyes: a spark, a determination, a message that seemed to say, "Not yet." The man shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was just a horse, after all. What could it possibly know about loss, about pain, about the crushing weight of giving up? But then it happened. The horse suddenly took a step forward, tugging gently at the reins. The man frowned, confused. He hadn't given any command, hadn't made any move to lead them anywhere. Yet the horse seemed intent, pulling again, more insistent this time. "What is it?" he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse from days of silence. The horse turned its head, its eyes meeting his, and in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't a look of pleading or fear. It was a look of purpose. The man hesitated, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to sink back into the mire of his despair. But another part, the part that still clung to the tiniest shred of hope, couldn't resist the silent pull of the horse's resolve. Slowly, reluctantly, he let the animal lead him, step by step, away from the ruins of his past and into the unknown. He didn't know where they were going or why the horse seemed so determined, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the faintest flicker of curiosity, of something other than the hollow ache of loss. The path they took was unfamiliar, winding through shadowed woods and across streams swollen with rain. The man stumbled more than once, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but the horse pressed on, its pace steady and unyielding. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to blur in the dark, wet night. The man was just about to give up, to let go of the reins and collapse into the mud, when they emerged into a clearing. He froze. In the center of the clearing stood something that made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But there it was, bathed in the pale light of the moon breaking through the clouds. For the first time in days, he felt something other than despair. He felt a question, rising unbidden in his mind, as he turned to look at the horse. "How did you know?" he whispered. The horse didn't answer, of course. It simply stood there, its dark eyes watching him, steady and calm. But in that moment, the man knew that whatever lay ahead, he couldn't turn back. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. And whatever the horse had led him to, It was something that would change everything. The clearing was quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, humming with an energy the man couldn't explain. He stood frozen, his boots sinking into the damp earth as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Before him, in the soft glow of the moon, was a structure old, weathered, and almost swallowed by the forest around it. It looked like a small cabin, but its crooked frame and sagging roof told him it hadn't been touched by human hands in years. Vines crept up its walls, and the windows, though smeared with dirt and grime, reflected the faintest glimmer of moonlight, as if inviting him closer. The man turned to the horse, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "This is what you brought me to?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The horse snorted softly, shaking its mane as if in response. It made no move to turn away or continue forward, it just stood there, steady and patient. For a moment, the man considered walking back the way they'd come. What could possibly be inside that cabin? Nothing, he told himself. Nothing but rot and memories left behind by whoever once called this place home. But something stopped him, a feeling he couldn't shake, like the air around him was thick with a purpose he didn't yet understand. Reluctantly, he took a step forward, the reins still clutched in his hand. The horse followed, its hooves making soft thuds against the wet ground. The closer he got to the cabin, the more he felt an unease settle in his chest. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something deeper, more complicated. He couldn't tell if it was the weight of the night or the strange determination of the horse that unsettled him. Either way, he was here now, and turning back didn't feel like an option anymore. The door to the cabin was partially ajar, creaking gently as the wind pushed against it. He reached out, his fingers brushing the rough wood. It felt solid, despite its age, as if the years hadn't quite managed to claim it. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, and the sound of the creak seemed to echo far too loud in the quiet night. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and earth. The man stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. It was small, just one main space with a stone hearth against the far wall. A broken chair lay on its side near the door, and a table, warped and leaning, stood in the center of the room. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed, and cobwebs hung from the corners like delicate, forgotten lace. But what caught his attention wasn't the furniture or the decay, it was the way the moonlight spilled through the cracked window and illuminated something on the table. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. There, lying in the center of the table, was a small, leather-bound book. It looked out of place, too clean, too well preserved to have been sitting there for years. His hand hesitated as he reached for it, a strange unease prickling at the back of his neck. The horse, still standing just outside the doorway, let out a soft whinny, as if urging him on. With a steadying breath, he picked up the book. The leather felt warm under his fingers, almost alive, and the weight of it was heavier than he expected. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the first page. There were words written in a neat, deliberate hand, but they weren't in a language he recognized. The letters seemed to twist and shift on the page, almost as if they were alive, refusing to be understood. He flipped through a few more pages, the same strange writing filling each one, until he reached a page near the middle. This one was different. There was a drawing, sketched in black ink, of what looked like the very cabin he was standing in. Below it, in the same mysterious script, was a single line that seemed to almost glow in the moonlight. "What is this?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared at the drawing, then back at the room around him. The details were exact: the broken chair, the warped table, even the cracks in the window. It was as if whoever had drawn it had been standing in this very spot. A shiver ran down his spine, and he closed the book abruptly, the sound breaking the silence like a gunshot. The horse let out another soft sound, its head lowering as if in some silent acknowledgement of what he had found. He wanted to leave. Every instinct told him to get out of that cabin, to drop the book and walk away from whatever strange force had brought him here. But something kept him rooted to the spot. It wasn't just the curiosity or the mystery of the book, it was something deeper, something he couldn't name. It felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a choice. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the sound of it tapping against the roof like a soft rhythm. He turned back toward the door, the book still in his hand, and looked at the horse. It stood there, unmoving, its eyes fixed on him with that same unwavering gaze. For a moment, he felt like it wasn't a horse at all, but something else, something that saw more than he could, that knew more than it could ever explain. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question wasn't directed at the horse, or the cabin, or even himself. It was a question thrown out into the universe, desperate and searching. But the answer, if there was one, didn't come. All he had was the book, the cabin, and the strange, quiet presence of the horse. And as he stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he realized something that sent a chill through his very core. Whatever had brought him here, whatever strange force had guided the horse to this place, it wasn't finished with him yet. The journey he thought had ended when he lost everything was only just beginning. And the road ahead, he knew, would be unlike anything he had ever imagined. The man lingered in the doorway, his fingers tightening around the edges of the book as though it might offer some kind of explanation if he held it long enough. But nothing changed. The writing inside still looked as incomprehensible as before, and the drawing of the cabin stared back at him like a challenge he didn't understand. He glanced back at the horse, half expecting it to move, to take him somewhere else, but it remained rooted in place, watching him. Its calmness unnerved him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It was as if the animal knew something he didn't, and was simply waiting for him to catch up. He stepped back inside the cabin, the air feeling heavier now, like the walls were holding secrets they weren't ready to share. His boots scraped against the uneven wooden floor as he moved toward the hearth. It was cold, the stones cracked with age, but there were faint remnants of ash inside, as though someone had been here not long ago. That didn't make sense. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time, yet the book wasn't dusty, and the hearth suggested a life that lingered after everything else had left. He crouched down, running his fingers over the stones, and found something tucked in the crevice between two of them. It was a small, folded piece of paper, brittle to the touch but intact. He opened it carefully, holding his breath, and saw a series of symbols that matched the writing in the book. But there was something else beneath the strange markings, was a crude drawing of a horse. His horse. The sight of it sent a jolt through him, a mixture of fear and disbelief. He stood up too quickly, his head spinning, and looked toward the door again. The horse was still there, its dark eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. How could this be? The drawing wasn't just any horse, it was unmistakably his. The markings on its face, the shape of its mane, it was all there. He felt the air grow colder around him, a chill seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the rain or the night. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He thought back to the events that had led him here, to the fire, the destruction, the loss that had left him broken. None of it made sense now. Not when faced with this strange place, this book, and the horse that had brought him here. Was it all connected? Had the fire been an accident, or was there something more at play? And why him? Why this horse? He felt like a pawn on a chessboard he couldn't see, moved by forces he couldn't begin to understand. The thought of staying in the cabin any longer made his skin crawl. He stepped outside, the rain now nothing more than a mist clinging to the trees. The horse turned its head slightly, watching him as he approached. He held the book tightly under one arm, the piece of paper folded in his pocket, and placed a hand on the horse's neck. Its warmth was a comfort, a reminder that at least one thing in this strange night was real and solid. "What now?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. The horse didn't move, but something in its gaze shifted. It wasn't just calm anymore, it was expectant, like it was waiting for him to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. He thought about the drawing, the symbols, and the strange feeling that had settled over him since they'd left the ruins of his home. Maybe the horse wasn't just leading him to safety. Maybe it was leading him towards something he needed to find. Reluctantly, he climbed onto its back, the book still clutched in one hand. The horse started moving almost immediately, its steps purposeful, as if it knew exactly where to go. They left the clearing behind, the cabin disappearing into the darkness as the trees closed in around them. The forest was dense, the path narrow and uneven, but the horse moved with ease, its ears flicking back and forth as though listening for something only it could hear. Time seemed to stretch and blur as they traveled. The man's thoughts churned with questions, each one heavier than the last. He thought of his family, the life they'd built together, and the way it had all been torn away in an instant. He thought of the fire, how quickly it had spread, and the strange sense he'd had even then that something about it wasn't natural. And now, this horse, this cabin, this book filled with words he couldn't read but felt like they were meant for him. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and the sound of rushing water reached his ears. The horse slowed as they approached a river, its surface shimmering under the faint moonlight. On the far side of the river was a figure, standing still and motionless, as though it had been waiting for them. The man's breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening on the reins. He couldn't make out any details, only the silhouette, a tall, thin shape cloaked in shadow. The horse stopped at the water's edge, its head lowering slightly. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the man felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force pressing down on him. He dismounted slowly, his legs trembling as he landed on the ground. The book in his hand felt heavier than ever, and he glanced down at it before looking back across the river. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice cracking with the strain of the night. The figure remained silent, but something about its stillness was an answer in itself. It didn't feel human. It felt like the embodiment of the questions that had been chasing him since the fire, questions that were growing heavier with every step he took. The horse let out a soft sound, breaking the tension, and nudged him gently with its nose. He took a shaky breath, his gaze darting between the book, the figure, and the horse. Whatever was happening, he was no longer sure he could run from it. The figure raised a hand slowly, pointing toward the book, and though it didn't speak, the meaning was clear. The book was the key. To what, he didn't know. But as he stood there on the edge of the river, the night pressing in around him, he felt a truth settle in his chest. There was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, whatever answers waited for him, they would only reveal themselves if he kept going. But the deeper he went, the more he realized that finding those answers might come at a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. The air around the river felt impossibly still, like the whole world was holding its breath. The man's grip on the book tightened, his knuckles white as he stared across at the shadowy figure. It hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with an unspoken intensity that made his chest feel tight. The horse stood at his side, quiet but watchful, its dark eyes flicking between him and the figure as though it, too, sensed the gravity of the moment. The man didn't know what to do. The figure's gesture toward the book had been clear, but what did it mean? He opened the cover again, his hands trembling, and flipped through the pages. The strange symbols danced before his eyes, refusing to form any sense, but he felt a pull toward the page with the drawing of the cabin. He stared at it, willing it to reveal something, anything that might explain why he was here. Behind him, the river began to ripple, the once calm surface shifting as though disturbed by an unseen force. He turned sharply, his heart pounding, but the water remained empty, reflecting the faint glow of the moon. Yet the sense of unease grew stronger, wrapping around him like a cold, invisible hand. He glanced back at the figure, but it hadn't moved. Still, he could feel its presence pressing against him, demanding something he didn't know how to give. The horse nudged him again, its breath warm against his shoulder, and he looked at it, desperate for some kind of reassurance. The animal's gaze was steady, almost urging, and for a moment, he thought he understood. He crouched down, the book balanced in his hands, and dipped his fingers into the river. The water was icy, sending a shock through his system, but as he brought his hand back up, droplets clinging to his skin, he saw something strange. The water seemed to shimmer unnaturally, the droplets catching the moonlight in a way that made them look almost alive. Without thinking, he let a single drop fall onto the page with the drawing. The reaction was immediate. The symbols began to shift, the ink bleeding and reforming into something new. His breath caught as the words rearranged themselves into a language he could understand, though the meaning was no less cryptic. What you seek lies beyond the veil, but the cost is everything you hold dear. The man's chest tightened, the weight of those words pressing down on him. He looked back at the figure, as if expecting some kind of explanation, but it remained silent and still, its arms still outstretched. The river's rippling grew more pronounced, the sound of the water now louder, almost angry. He turned back to the horse, the one solid thing in this strange, shifting reality, and for the first time, he saw hesitation in its eyes. "Is this it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rushing water. "Is this what you brought me to?" The horse didn't answer, of course, but it lowered its head slightly, almost in acknowledgement. The man felt his pulse quicken, a mix of fear and determination coursing through him. He didn't know what lay beyond the veil, didn't understand the cost the book had warned him about, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. The figure moved for the first time. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its other hand and pointed to the river. The man's stomach churned as he realized what it wanted. The river wasn't just water, it was the barrier between everything he knew and whatever waited on the other side. Crossing it meant committing to something he couldn't take back, something he didn't fully understand. He glanced down at the book again, the words on the page glowing faintly now, as if urging him forward. With a deep breath, he stepped toward the river's edge. The horse followed, its steps cautious but steady, and together they stood at the brink. The water lapped at his boots, colder than anything he'd ever felt, and he hesitated. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its silent presence was enough to push him forward. Slowly, he waded into the river, the water rising around him with each step. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at him with an almost sentient force, but he held tight to the book and kept moving. The horse followed close behind, its movements calm and deliberate despite the surging water. When they reached the middle of the river, everything changed. The current stilled, the air grew impossibly quiet, and the world around them seemed to shift. The forest, the moonlight, even the figure on the shore, all of it faded, replaced by a vast expanse of darkness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The man's breath caught in his throat, his grip on the book tightening as he turned in circles, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The horse was still there, its presence a small comfort in the overwhelming void. But the figure was gone, and the river had disappeared, leaving them standing on what felt like solid ground, though he couldn't see it. The darkness pressed against him, heavy and suffocating, and for a moment, he thought he might lose himself entirely. Then, out of the void came a sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hum grew louder, building into a deep vibration that shook the ground beneath his feet. The horse shifted uneasily, its ears flicking back, and the man felt a surge of panic. He clutched the book to his chest, the words on the page now glowing brighter, and looked around desperately for any sign of what was happening. Out of the darkness, a shape began to form, massive and formless, shifting and twisting like smoke caught in a storm. It loomed over them, its presence filling the void with an energy that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The man's legs felt like they might give out beneath him, but he forced himself to stand, his gaze locked on the swirling mass. It didn't have a face, but he felt its attention on him, sharp and unrelenting. The hum shifted, forming into a deep, rumbling voice that echoed in his mind rather than his ears. "You have come seeking answers," it said, the words vibrating through him. "But answers are never without cost." The man's mouth was dry, his voice barely a whisper when he spoke. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his words trembling. The entity didn't respond immediately, its shape shifting and twisting as though considering him. When it finally spoke again, its voice was colder, more deliberate. "Everything." The weight of that single word hit him like a blow, and he staggered back, his hands shaking. He thought of the warning in the book, the cryptic message about the cost of crossing the veil. Was this what it meant? He looked at the horse, its steady presence the only thing keeping him grounded, and felt a surge of defiance. He had already lost so much: his family, his home, everything that had ever mattered to him. What more could this thing possibly take? But deep down, he knew the answer. It wasn't just about what he had already lost. It was about what little he still had left: the memories, the fleeting hope that had kept him moving forward. This entity, whatever it was, didn't just want his possessions or his life. It wanted his very soul, the essence of who he was. And in return, it would give him the truth he had been searching for. The man's mind raced, torn between the weight of the decision and the relentless pull of the unknown. The void around him seemed to grow darker, the entity's presence more oppressive, as if it were running out of patience. He looked down at the book, its glow pulsating faintly, and then at the horse, which met his gaze with a quiet strength that seemed to say, "You're not alone." But even that small comfort couldn't ease the crushing reality of the choice before him. And as the entity's voice echoed again, its demand unyielding, the man felt the weight of everything come crashing down around him, leaving him standing on the precipice of a decision that would change everything one way or another. The void seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, each beat matching the thundering of his heart. The man stood frozen, the weight of the entity's demand pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. He glanced at the horse, hoping for some sign, some clue as to what he should do, but the animal simply watched him, its calm presence steady but unreadable. The glowing words in the book flickered, dimming for a moment as if warning him that time was running out. He felt trapped, paralyzed by the enormity of the choice before him, but then something unexpected happened. The air shifted, a sharp, cutting wind slicing through the stillness of the void. It wasn't like the oppressive presence of the entity, this was something different, something alive. The man turned sharply, his grip on the book tightening, and saw a faint glimmer in the distance. It was small at first, just a pinprick of light, but it grew rapidly, cutting through the darkness with a force that seemed to challenge the entity's dominance. The hum of the entity's voice faltered, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that seemed almost afraid. The glimmer became a figure, bathed in soft, golden light that flickered like a flame in the wind. It was humanoid, but its edges were blurred, shifting constantly like smoke caught in sunlight. The figure stepped forward, its presence somehow both gentle and overwhelming, and the man felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He didn't know who or what this was, but it felt familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite place. The entity recoiled slightly, its formless mass twisting and writhing as if in pain. The voice that had been so commanding before now sounded strained, almost desperate. "You cannot interfere," it growled, the words heavy with anger. "He has made his choice." The figure didn't respond immediately, its glowing form turning toward the man instead. Though it had no face, he felt its gaze on him, piercing and yet comforting at the same time. When it spoke, its voice was soft but carried an undeniable power. "You have been led here by forces you do not understand," it said, the words resonating deeply within him. "But you are not alone in this. The choice is not yours to make alone." The man's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what the figure meant, but the sense of relief that washed over him was almost overwhelming. He looked down at the book in his hands, the glowing words now flickering erratically, and then back at the figure. "What?" "What is this?" he managed to choke out. "Why me? Why now?" The figure stepped closer, its light growing warmer, and for the first time, the man felt the darkness of the void begin to recede. "There are forces at play far older than you can imagine," it said, its voice tinged with sorrow. "You were chosen not because of what you have lost, but because of what you have yet to give. But be warned, every choice comes with a cost." The entity roared, its massive form surging forward as though trying to reassert control. The void trembled, the ground beneath the man's feet shaking violently, but the figure raised a hand, and the darkness seemed to falter. The two forces clashed in silence, their energies colliding in a way that made the man feel like the very fabric of reality was being stretched to its limits. In the chaos, the horse let out a sudden, sharp sound, a sound that cut through everything like a blade. The man turned to see it staring at the figure, its body tense, and for the first time, he saw something in its eyes that he hadn't noticed before. Recognition. The horse wasn't just a guide, wasn't just an anchor in this strange journey, it was connected to this somehow, tied to the forces that were now battling for control. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. The horse hadn't brought him here by accident. It had known all along where they were going, what waited for them. But why? What was its role in all of this? The man felt a surge of anger and confusion, his voice rising as he shouted into the chaos, "What do you want from me? Why me?" The figure turned back to him, its light dimming slightly as though burdened by his question. "You carry a burden that is not yours alone," it said softly. "But your journey does not end here. You must choose, not for yourself, but for all who came before and all who will come after. What you decide will ripple through the fabric of time itself." The entity roared again, its voice shaking the air. "He is mine!" it bellowed, its form surging closer. The man staggered back, his mind racing as the weight of the figure's words settled over him. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger than anything he could have imagined, bigger than his losses, his pain, his search for answers. He looked down at the book, its glow steady now, as if waiting for him to act. The figure and the entity clashed again, the void erupting into chaos as their energies collided. The man fell to his knees, the book slipping from his grasp and landing open on the ground. The symbols on the page began to shift once more, forming a new message: to save what was lost, you must face the truth. The man's chest tightened. What truth? What was he supposed to face? The horse stepped closer, its body shielding him from the chaos, and he felt its warmth against his side. For a moment, everything else faded: the void, the clash of light and darkness, even the weight of the book. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and when he opened them again, he knew what he had to do. But just as he reached for the book, the ground beneath him shifted violently, and he felt himself falling. The void swallowed him whole, the horse's frantic cry echoing in his ears as he plunged into darkness. The last thing he saw was the figure's glowing form, reaching out toward him as if trying to pull him back, but it was too late. And then, nothing. Just silence, cold and absolute, as if the world itself had ceased to exist. The silence was deafening, a void deeper and darker than anything he had felt before. For a moment, the man thought he was gone, lost forever in the emptiness. His body felt weightless, his mind detached, like a fragment of himself drifting in a place beyond time and space. But then, faintly at first, he heard it, a rhythmic sound, steady and familiar. A heartbeat. Not his own, but close, echoing through the void and pulling him back. The darkness began to shift, not with light but with sensation. Cold air brushed against his skin, followed by the unmistakable feeling of solid ground beneath his hands. He opened his eyes, gasping as if surfacing from deep water, and found himself kneeling in a strange place. It was a forest, but not the one he had known. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches twisting in ways that defied nature, and the air shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Everything felt alive, as though the forest itself was watching him. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling, and looked around. The book was gone. The horse was nowhere in sight. Panic rose in his chest, but before it could take hold, a familiar presence washed over him. He turned sharply to see the figure from the void standing a few feet away, its golden light softer now, almost subdued. It didn't speak, but its presence was enough to steady him. The man took a cautious step forward, his voice shaky as he asked, "Where am I? What happened?" The figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture that felt almost compassionate, and finally spoke. "You have crossed the veil," it said, its voice quiet but resonant. "This is where truth and choice converge." Before he could respond, the forest around him shifted. The trees bent and swayed, their movements unnatural, and the ground beneath him rippled like water. The air grew heavy, and from the shadows between the trees, the entity emerged. Its form was smaller now, less imposing, but its presence was no less menacing. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its voice low and venomous. "You cannot escape what you owe," it said, its words wrapping around him like chains. "You crossed the river. You accepted the terms." The man backed away instinctively, his heart racing. He looked to the figure for help, but it remained still, its light dimming slightly. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice desperate. "I didn't understand what I was agreeing to." The entity laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. "Ignorance does not absolve you," it hissed. "The cost must be paid." The man's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the entity was closing in, its form shifting and expanding as it prepared to engulf him. Just as the shadows reached him, a sudden, piercing sound filled the air. A sharp, ringing tone that cut through everything, the kind of sound that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside the soul. The man turned, his eyes widening as he saw the horse standing at the edge of the clearing. Its presence was unlike anything he had ever seen. The horse's coat shimmered with the same golden light as the figure, its mane flowing like liquid fire. It stepped forward, each movement deliberate, and the ground seemed to steady beneath its hooves. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and retreating as though burned by the horse's light. The man's breath caught as he realized the truth. The horse wasn't just a companion or a guide, it was something far greater, something ancient and powerful, tied to this place in ways he couldn't begin to understand. The figure spoke again, its voice calm but commanding. "The choice is yours to make, but you are not alone. The bonds that brought you here are stronger than you know." The man looked between the horse, the figure, and the entity, his mind spinning. The book's warning echoed in his head, "The cost is everything you hold dear." Was this the cost? Was he meant to sacrifice himself, or was there another way? The horse stepped closer, its dark eyes locking onto his, and he felt a wave of understanding wash over him. The cost wasn't about loss, it was about letting go. Letting go of the guilt, the anger, the fear that had driven him here. Letting go of the need for answers and accepting the unknown. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling, and stepped toward the horse. The entity roared, its shadowy form surging forward in one last desperate attempt to claim him, but the horse reared back, its light exploding outward in a blinding flash. The man shielded his eyes, the force of the light knocking him off his feet, and when he opened them again, the forest was silent. The entity was gone, its presence erased as though it had never existed. The horse stood calmly before him, its light dimming as it lowered its head. The figure approached, its voice soft but filled with purpose. "You have faced the truth and made your choice. The path ahead is yours to walk." The man looked around, the forest now bathed in a soft, golden glow, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers, he might never have them, but for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt free. But just as he thought it was over, the ground beneath him shifted again. This time, It wasn't violent or chaotic, it was subtle, almost gentle, like a ripple in a pond. The horse stepped back, its gaze never leaving his, and the figure's light began to fade. The man tried to call out, to ask what was happening, but before he could, the world around him dissolved into light. When he opened his eyes, he was standing on the riverbank, the book clutched tightly in his hands. The forest was quiet, the river calm, and the horse stood beside him, its coat as ordinary as it had been when they first began. But something was different. The man looked down at the book, its pages now blank, and felt a weight lift from his chest. He didn't need the answers anymore. The journey had been the answer. As he turned to leave, the horse nudged him gently, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of golden light in its eyes. A reminder, perhaps, of what they had faced together. The man smiled, a genuine smile that felt foreign but welcome, and together they walked away from the river, leaving the shadows behind. But somewhere, in the depths of the forest, a faint hum echoed a sound that hinted at unfinished business, at forces still at play. The man didn't hear it, but the horse paused for a moment, its ears flicking back. Then, with a quiet snort, it moved on, the sound fading into the distance as the two disappeared into the trees. As the man and the horse moved away from the riverbank, the world around them began to feel oddly serene, as though it had been waiting for this very moment. The air smelled fresher, the light seemed softer, and the weight of everything that had led him to this place seemed to melt away with each step. He didn't know where they were going, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to ask. The horse walked beside him, steady and calm, a quiet presence that offered comfort without words. For a long while, they walked in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet the only sound. The forest was different now. It no longer loomed with shadowy threats or whispered unspoken fears. Instead, it felt alive in a way he couldn't explain, as though it were breathing alongside him, rooting for him somehow. He glanced at the horse, still marveling at how ordinary it seemed now. But he knew better. He knew that what he had witnessed, what they had been through together, was anything but ordinary. As they continued, small memories of the journey began to surface in his mind, like fragments of a dream. The strange village. The book. The figure of light. The entity that had nearly consumed him. And then, of course, the choice he had made. He still didn't fully understand the scope of what had happened, but he knew that it had changed him. It wasn't just about survival or redemption anymore. It was about accepting what he couldn't control and finding peace in that acceptance. Eventually, the forest began to thin, and through the trees, he caught sight of open land stretching out before them. He stopped at the edge of the forest, taking in the view. Rolling hills bathed in golden sunlight, a far-off stream glinting like silver in the distance, and a sky so vast and blue it felt like freedom itself. The horse nudged him gently, urging him forward, and he smiled, his first real smile in what felt like years. They walked into the open together, the forest behind them fading into the horizon. For the first time, he felt like he was truly leaving something behind, not just a physical place, but the pain, the loss, and the questions that had haunted him for so long. He glanced at the horse again and found himself speaking without really thinking. "I don't know if I'll ever understand all of this," he said quietly. "But thank you for staying with me." The horse flicked its ears and let out a soft whinny, and though it didn't speak, the man felt as though it had heard him. They continued walking, and as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, they came across a small stream. The man knelt by the water, cupping his hands to drink, and caught his reflection in the rippling surface. He looked different. Not in a way anyone else might notice, but in a way he could feel. The lines of worry that had once etched themselves into his face seemed softer now, his eyes less burdened. He let out a long breath, watching the ripples fade, and felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. As the days passed, their journey became simpler, less marked by the strange and unexplainable. The man found himself thinking less about what had happened and more about what lay ahead. He started to notice the small things, the way the wind rustled through the grass, the sound of the horse's hooves on the earth, the warmth of the sun on his skin. He realized how much he had taken these moments for granted before, how caught up he had been in chasing something that had always been just out of reach. One evening, as they rested beneath a canopy of stars, he spoke aloud again, this time not to the horse but to the silence around him. "I think I understand now," he said, his voice steady. "It wasn't about finding what I lost. It was about finding myself. About letting go." The words felt true in a way that surprised him, and as he lay back and stared up at the endless sky, he felt a peace he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. The horse stayed by his side through it all, a constant companion as the days turned to weeks. They crossed fields and streams, climbed hills and descended into valleys, and though they didn't seem to be heading anywhere in particular, the man no longer cared. The journey itself was enough. The moments they shared, however small, were enough. But as all journeys do, this one eventually found its end. They came to a quiet village nestled at the base of a mountain, a place that felt warm and welcoming in a way that made the man's heart ache with longing. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to this place, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The villagers greeted him with kind smiles and open hearts, offering him food and shelter without question. He accepted gratefully, the weight of his travels finally catching up to him. Over time, the man found himself becoming a part of the village. He helped with small tasks, shared stories by the fire, and began to rebuild the life he had thought he'd lost forever. The horse stayed with him, of course, a constant presence that the villagers quickly came to admire. They called it the Golden One, though its coat was as plain as ever, and treated it with a reverence that made the man smile. One evening, as the man sat outside his small home, watching the sun dip below the mountains, he felt a familiar warmth beside him. The horse stood there, its eyes calm and knowing, and for a moment he thought he saw that golden light flicker in its gaze once more. He reached out, resting a hand on its neck, and whispered, "I think this is where I'm meant to be. Thank you for bringing me here." The horse nuzzled him gently, and though it didn't speak, the man felt its answer clear as day. They stayed like that for a while, the two of them watching the world settle into night, and for the first time in a long time, the man felt whole. The days turned to months, and the man's life in the village grew richer with each passing season. He never told anyone the full story of his journey. Some things, he felt, were meant to stay between him and the horse, but he carried the lessons of that journey with him every day. He learned to appreciate the small moments, to find joy in the simple things, and to let go of the pain and questions that had once defined him. One morning, the horse was gone. The man woke to find its stall empty, the gate left ajar, and though a pang of sadness gripped his heart, he understood. The horse had done its part. It had guided him through the darkest chapters of his life and brought him to a place where he could finally heal. It was time for it to move on, just as he had. He stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the fields where they had often walked together, and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind. He didn't know where the horse had gone, but he knew that its light, its presence, would stay with him forever. As he turned back toward the village, the sun rising behind him, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart. His journey wasn't over, it never would be, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. With each step, he carried the lessons of the past, the hope of the present, and the promise of a future he couldn't yet see. And that, he realized, was enough.